Lady Eveline Ashworth had never imagined that her life of privilege could end so abruptly. Standing on the deck of her family's merchant vessel, the Crimson Rose, she watched in horror as a sleek predator emerged from the morning mist off the Carolinas coast. The ship approaching them moved with deadly grace, its black sails billowing like the wings of some terrible bird of prey, and the crimson flag at its mast bore a skull crowned with thorns, the mark of Captain Darius Kane, the most feared corsair in American waters. At 21, Eveline possessed the refined beauty expected of English nobility. Auburn hair arranged in perfect ringlets, emerald eyes that had never seen true hardship, and skin as pale as porcelain from a life spent in drawing rooms and ballrooms. Her silk traveling gown, imported from Paris at enormous expense, seemed absurdly delicate against the rough backdrop of ship rigging and ocean spray. She had been returning to her father's estate in Virginia after a season in London, her head full of court gossip and marriage prospects. Now, those concerns seemed as distant as the stars. "Lady Eveline, please go below deck immediately," urged Captain Morrison, the grizzled sailor who had served her family for over a decade. His weathered face was pale with fear as he watched the pirate ship close the distance between them. This is no place for a lady. But Eveline found herself frozen at the rail, mesmerized by the approaching vessel despite her terror. The Crimson Rose was a fine ship, but it had been built for trade, not warfare. Against a purpose-built predator like the one bearing down on them, they stood about as much chance as a dove against a hawk. The attack came with brutal efficiency. Grappling hooks flew across the narrowing gap between ships, followed by boarding planks that bridged the divide like instruments of judgment. The first pirates to swing aboard moved with the deadly precision of seasoned killers, cutting down the few armed sailors with casual brutality. Eveline watched in stunned disbelief as men she had known since childhood fell beneath cutlass and pistol shot, their blood staining the deck where she had once taken leisurely morning walks. Then she saw him. Captain Darius Kane stepped aboard the Crimson Rose like he was claiming a throne that had always been his by right. He was tall and powerfully built, moving with the fluid confidence of a man equally at home in a palace or on a battlefield. His long black hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the kind of aristocratic features that spoke of noble blood gone wrong. But it was his eyes that made Eveline's breath catch in her throat, pale green, like sea glass, beautiful and utterly without mercy. He wore a long coat of midnight blue velvet that had obviously been tailored by the finest hands, over dark leather breeches and tall boots that gleamed despite the harsh conditions at sea. Twin pistols hung at his hips, their silver mountings catching the morning light, and a sword with an ornate basket hilt completed his arsenal. This was no common cutthroat, but a gentleman turned predator, which somehow made him infinitely more dangerous. Kane surveyed the carnage with the detached interest of a connoisseur examining fine art, his gaze passing over cowering passengers and crew like they were inventory to be catalogued. When those sea-glass eyes fell on Eveline, she felt as if she were being measured for a coffin, or something worse. "My Lord Captain," one of his men reported with obvious deference, "the cargo hold contains fine goods and coin, but nothing extraordinary. However, we did find this." He held up a leather portfolio bearing the Ashworth family crest. Kane took the portfolio and examined it with interest, his educated fingers tracing the embossed coat of arms. "The Ashworth shipping fortune," he murmured, his voice carrying the cultured accent of the English upper classes. "How very interesting." His gaze returned to Eveline, and this time there was a calculating gleam in those beautiful, terrible eyes. "You would be Lady Eveline," he said, approaching her with the measured steps of a predator who knew his prey could not escape. "Daughter of the Earl of Westmore, heir to one of England's greatest shipping fortunes." Eveline forced herself to stand straight despite the terror coursing through her veins. She had been raised to believe that noble blood carried obligations, and even facing death, she would not shame her family's name. "I am. And you, I presume, are the murderous dog who calls himself Captain Kane." A collective gasp went up from the watching pirates and passengers alike. No one spoke to Darius Kane with such contempt and lived to regret it. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Eveline was certain she was about to join her father's sailors in death. Instead, Kane threw back his head and laughed, a sound that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. "Murderous dog. My dear Lady Eveline, you wound me. I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with unconventional methods. He circled her slowly, like a shark studying its prey, taking in every detail of her appearance with unsettling intensity. Tell me, your ladyship, what do you suppose your father would pay for your safe return? The Ashworth fortune is considerable, but grief makes men generous beyond reason. Eveline's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. My father will pay whatever ransom you demand, but if you harm me, he will see you hunted to the ends of the earth. Ransom? Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. Who said anything about ransom? No, Lady Eveline. You're far too valuable for such a mundane transaction. Before Eveline could ask what he meant, Kane turned to address his crew. Secure the cargo and prepare to scuttle this vessel. As for the passengers and crew, he paused, his gaze returning to Eveline with that same calculating intensity. They'll be coming with us. I find myself in need of witnesses for a rather special occasion. The transfer to Kane's ship, the Serpent's Kiss, was accomplished with terrifying efficiency. Eveline found herself aboard a vessel that was clearly built for both speed and warfare, every line of its construction speaking of deadly purpose. The crew moved with the discipline of a naval vessel, but their loyalty was clearly to Kane alone, rather than any crown or country. As the Crimson Rose disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it the last remnant of Eveline's old life, Kane appeared beside her at the rail. Up close, she could see the network of scars that mapped his hands and face, evidence of a life lived at the edge of violence. But there was something else, a refinement in his bearing that spoke of education and breeding, as if a duke's son had chosen to become a devil. Magnificent, isn't she? Kane said, gesturing toward his ship with obvious pride. The Serpent's Kiss can outrun any naval vessel in these waters and outfight anything she can't outrun. Eveline refused to show admiration for the instrument of her captivity. She's a tool of murder and theft, nothing more. Such harsh words from such lovely lips, Kane replied, but there was amusement rather than anger in his tone. You'll find, Lady Eveline, that the world beyond your father's estate operates by different rules than those taught in finishing schools. And what rules would those be? Eveline demanded. Might makes right? The strong prey upon the weak? Kane's expression grew serious, and for a moment she glimpsed something deeper beneath his predatory exterior. Pain, perhaps, or old wounds that had never properly healed. The rule that survival matters more than honor, and that the world shows no mercy to those who cannot defend themselves. Before Eveline could respond, Kane's first mate approached with obvious reluctance. He was a scarred man with intelligent eyes who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with whatever he had to report. Captain, the first mate said quietly. The lady's escort included several men of obvious quality. One bears a signet ring marking him as a member of Parliament. Kane's eyebrows rose with interest. How very convenient. Summon all our guests to the main deck, Mr. Hawthorne. It's time to make my intentions clear. As the surviving passengers and crew of the Crimson Rose were herded onto the deck of the Serpent's Kiss, Eveline felt a growing dread settle in her stomach. Whatever Kane had planned, it was more than simple piracy. The calculating look in his eyes spoke of a game far more complex and dangerous than mere robbery. Ladies and gentlemen, Kane announced, his voice carrying easily across the deck, you are about to witness a historic occasion. Lady Eveline Ashworth, daughter of the Earl of Westmore, is about to become my bride. The declaration hit Eveline like a physical blow. Around her, gasps of shock and outrage rose from the assembled witnesses, but she could barely hear them over the roaring in her ears. You're insane, she whispered, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. Kane smiled with the satisfaction of a man who held all the cards in a deadly game. Am I? Consider your position, my dear. Your escort is dead. Your ship is at the bottom of the ocean, and you are entirely at my mercy. Marriage to me offers you protection, status among my crew, and most importantly, it ensures the survival of these witnesses to our union. The threat was clear. Comply, or watch innocent people die for her defiance. Eveline looked around at the frightened faces of servants and sailors who had served her family faithfully, and realized that Kane had trapped her as neatly as any spider ever caught a fly. This is madness, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. This is pragmatism, Kane corrected gently. You are worth more to me as a wife than as a prisoner, and marriage will legitimize any children we might have. As for your feelings on the matter, he shrugged elegantly. I'm sure you'll adjust. As the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her, Eveline felt the last of her sheltered world crumble away. She was no longer Lady Eveline Ashworth, pampered daughter of nobility. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, played by a man whose motives remained as mysterious as they were terrifying. The pirate captain who stood before her might wear the face of an angel and speak with the voice of a gentleman, but Eveline could see the steel beneath his polished exterior. Darius Kane was a predator who had chosen her as his prey, and she was about to discover just how far from civilization the rules of honor and decency could fall. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything Eveline could have imagined in her worst nightmares. Captain Kane summoned his crew to witness the union, while the survivors from the Crimson Rose were forced to serve as unwilling guests. The ship's chaplain, a thin man with nervous eyes and shaking hands, performed the rites with obvious reluctance. "Dearly beloved," the chaplain began, his voice barely audible above the creaking of the ship and the whisper of wind through the rigging. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Eveline stood beside Kane in her torn and salt-stained traveling dress, feeling like she was attending her own funeral rather than her wedding. The pirate captain had made no effort to change his appearance for the occasion. He still wore his dark coat and weapons, as if marriage were just another form of conquest to be achieved through force of arms. "Do you, Darius Kane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the chaplain asked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool ocean breeze. "I do," Kane replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. When he took Eveline's hand, she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch, though his grip was firm enough to prevent any thought of escape. "And do you, Lady Eveline Ashworth, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eveline looked around at the faces surrounding her, Kane's crew watching with mixture of curiosity and respect, the survivors from her ship staring with horror and pity. She thought of her father, who would be devastated by news of her fate, and of the life of privilege and safety she was leaving behind forever. "I do," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Kane produced a ring from his coat, a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds that looked like it belonged in a royal treasury. As he slipped it onto her finger, Eveline noticed how perfectly it fit, as if it had been made specifically for her hand. "By the power vested in me by God and the sea," the chaplain concluded hastily, "I now pronounce you man and wife." The crew erupted in cheers and applause, though Eveline noticed several faces that seemed less than enthusiastic about their captain's sudden marriage. When Kane leaned down to kiss her, she steeled herself for rough treatment, but his lips were surprisingly gentle against hers. "Welcome to your new life, Lady Kane," he murmured against her ear, and Eveline shivered at the possessive satisfaction in his voice. As the crew dispersed and the witnesses were led away, Kane offered Eveline his arm with courtly grace that seemed absurdly out of place on a pirate vessel. "Shall I show you to our cabin, my dear wife?" The captain's quarters were a revelation that challenged everything Eveline thought she knew about pirates. Instead of the crude den she expected, she found herself in what could only be described as a gentleman's study that happened to be at sea. Rich tapestries covered the walls, fine furniture was secured against the ship's movement, and shelves of leather-bound books lined every available space. "Surprised?" Kane asked, watching her reaction with amusement. "Not quite what you expected from a bloodthirsty corsair?" Eveline ran her fingers along the spine of a volume of Shakespeare, noting the gold-leaf lettering and expensive binding. "Where did you get all this?" "Some was taken from conquered ships," Kane replied with casual honesty, "but most belonged to me long before I took to the sea. I wasn't always a pirate, Lady Kane." The use of her new name sent another shiver through Eveline. "What were you before?" Kane moved to a cabinet and poured 2 glasses of what looked like expensive wine. "A gentleman, a fool, a younger son with more honor than sense." He offered her a glass which she accepted despite her better judgment. "But that man died the same day I became Captain Kane." Eveline sipped the wine, surprised by its quality. "And what killed him?" Kane's expression darkened, and she saw a flash of the pain she had glimpsed earlier. "Betrayal. The kind that teaches you the world has no place for honorable men." Before Eveline could press for more details, Kane moved to his desk and withdrew a document bearing official seals. "This might interest you. A letter of marque from the colonial governor authorizing my activities against Spanish shipping." Eveline stared at the document in confusion. "You're a privateer, not a pirate?" The distinction matters little to those on the receiving end of my cannons, Kane replied dryly, but it does provide a certain legal protection for my business activities. The revelation that Kane operated with official sanction, however limited, complicated Eveline's understanding of her situation. He wasn't just a common criminal, but something far more complex and dangerous. "Why did you really marry me?" she asked, setting down her wineglass. The truth this time. Kane studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing how much honesty she could handle. "Because you're worth more than gold, to the right people. Because marriage protects you from my crew better than any guard could. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because something about you reminds me of the man I used to be." Eveline felt her heart skip at the unexpected vulnerability in his admission. "And what if I refuse to play the role of dutiful wife?" Kane's smile returned, though it held less warmth than before. "Then you'll discover that I can be very persuasive when properly motivated." As night fell over the ship, Eveline found herself alone with her new husband in quarters that would now be their shared prison. Kane had shown her unexpected courtesy, but she harbored no illusions about her situation. She was property now, valuable property perhaps, but property nonetheless. "I won't share your bed," she announced, trying to summon the authority she had once wielded as her father's daughter. Kane raised an eyebrow at her declaration. "Won't you? And where exactly do you propose to sleep on a ship in the middle of the ocean?" Eveline looked around the cabin, realizing with growing dismay that there was indeed only one bed, and nowhere else that offered even basic comfort or privacy. "I can be patient, Lady Kane," Kane said softly, noting her dilemma. "But I am your husband now, in the eyes of God and the law. Eventually you'll come to accept what that means." As Kane began to undress for the night with casual indifference to her presence, Eveline turned away, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. She had gone from lady to wife to prisoner in the span of a single day, and the man responsible seemed to view her distress as nothing more than temporary inconvenience. "One day," she said quietly, her back still turned to him, "you'll regret forcing me into this marriage." Kane's laughter was soft, but somehow ominous. "My dear wife, I've regretted many things in my life, but I have a feeling that claiming you will not be one of them." The first weeks of Eveline's marriage to Captain Kane were a study in careful negotiation and unspoken boundaries. True to his word, Kane showed patience regarding the more intimate aspects of their union, though his presence in their shared cabin was a constant reminder of what he expected would eventually come to pass. During the day, Eveline was given the freedom of the ship, accompanied always by Mr. Hawthorne, Kane's first mate, who treated her with the respect due a captain's wife, while ensuring she never had opportunity to cause trouble. The crew of the Serpent's Kiss was unlike any group of men Eveline had ever encountered. Rather than the crude cutthroats she expected, she found former sailors from various navies, displaced gentlemen fallen on hard times, and men seeking fortune in waters where traditional authority held little sway. They treated her with a deference that spoke of Kane's absolute authority, but also of a code of conduct that protected women aboard their vessel. It was during one of these explorations that Eveline discovered the ship's most intriguing passenger. In a small cabin near the galley, she found a woman of perhaps 30 years with intelligent dark eyes and clothes that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of hard travel. "Lady Kane," the woman said, rising with a curtsy that spoke of noble training. "I am Mrs. Catherine Blackwood, late of His Majesty's colony of Jamaica." Eveline was startled to find another woman of quality aboard the pirate vessel. "Mrs. Blackwood, I hadn't realized. That is, Captain Kane didn't mention other passengers." Catherine's smile was tinged with sadness. "I suspect your husband has many secrets he hasn't yet shared. I've been aboard the Serpent's Kiss for nearly 2 months, ever since my own ship was intercepted." The euphemism didn't disguise the reality of what had happened. "You were captured as well?" In a manner of speaking, Catherine gestured for Eveline to sit on the narrow bunk that served as the cabin's only furniture. "Though my situation is rather different from yours. I came aboard willingly, seeking passage away from certain complications." Eveline studied the other woman's face, noting the careful way she chose her words. "What sort of complications?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "My late husband left me with debts that certain unsavory creditors were eager to collect through means other than coin. Captain Kane offered me protection in exchange for services." "What sort of services?" Evelyn asked, though she dreaded the answer. I was a physician's wife for many years, and learned much of his trade. The crew has need of someone with medical knowledge, and Captain Kane values educated individuals. Catherine's expression grew more serious. But there's more to it than that. Much more. Before Evelyn could ask what she meant, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Catherine immediately fell silent, her face assuming the neutral expression of someone practiced in keeping secrets. Kane appeared in the doorway, his sea-glass eyes taking in the scene with sharp intelligence. I see you've met Mrs. Blackwood. I trust she's been enlightening company. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew exactly what had been discussed and what had been carefully avoided. Evelyn felt the weight of unspoken tensions in the small cabin. Mrs. Blackwood was telling me about her medical knowledge. Evelyn replied carefully. It's fortunate that you have someone with such skills aboard. Indeed, Kane agreed, though his gaze remained fixed on Catherine. Mrs. Blackwood's presence has been invaluable in many ways, haven't you, my dear? Catherine inclined her head slightly. I serve as best I can, Captain. The exchange was perfectly polite, but Evelyn sensed undercurrents of meaning that she couldn't decipher. Kane's relationship with the physician's widow clearly went beyond simple professional necessity. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Blackwood, Kane said, offering his arm to Evelyn with courtly grace, I'd like to show my wife more of her new home. As they walked away from Catherine's cabin, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something significant, though she couldn't quite identify what. Kane led her up to the quarterdeck, where the afternoon sun painted the ocean in shades of gold and azure. She knows you, Evelyn said without preamble. Mrs. Blackwood, you knew each other before she came aboard. Kane's smile was neither confirmation nor denial. What makes you think that? The way you spoke to each other. The way she looked at you. Evelyn turned to face him fully. Who is she really, Darius? The use of his given name seemed to catch Kane off guard. It was the first time Evelyn had spoken it since their wedding, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. Catherine Blackwood is exactly who she claims to be, he replied carefully. A widow seeking protection from those who would do her harm. And you're providing that protection out of the goodness of your heart? Kane's laugh was short and humorless. My heart, as you've observed, is not particularly good. No, Lady Kane, I protect Mrs. Blackwood for more practical reasons. Such as? Kane was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless horizon as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to voice. Such as the fact that she reminds me of what I lost when I became what I am now. The admission was unexpected in its honesty, and Evelyn felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. You care for her. I care for very few people in this world, Kane replied quietly. Those I do care for I protect with everything at my disposal. And am I among those few? Evelyn asked, surprised by her own boldness. Kane turned to look at her, and for a moment his mask of controlled indifference slipped completely. What she saw beneath it was complex and contradictory. Desire, protectiveness, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine affection. You are my wife, he said simply. That makes you mine to protect whether you welcome that protection or not. That evening, as Evelyn prepared for another night of sharing quarters with her enigmatic husband, she found herself thinking about Catherine Blackwood and the secrets that seemed to surround everyone aboard the Serpent's Kiss. Kane moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency, but she noticed how often his gaze lingered on her, as if he were trying to solve some complex puzzle. Tell me about your family, Evelyn said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Kane paused in the act of removing his coat. What about them? You said you were a younger son. What happened to your elder brother? Your parents? Kane's expression grew shuttered, and for a moment Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her heart ache despite herself. My elder brother inherited everything as was proper. My parents died believing their younger son was an honorable man serving his country with distinction. Kane's smile was bitter as winter wind. They never lived to learn what I became. And what did you become? Kane met her eyes directly, and in that gaze she saw years of regret and carefully buried grief. A man who discovered that honor is a luxury only the powerful can afford. A man who learned that sometimes survival requires abandoning everything you once believed about right and wrong. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest at his words. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition of a pain that ran deeper than she had imagined. "What happened to you, Darius?" For a moment she thought he might actually tell her. His lips parted as if to speak, and she saw vulnerability flicker across his features like sunlight through storm clouds. Then the moment passed, and his mask of control slid back into place. "Nothing that would interest a lady of your sheltered upbringing," he said, but his tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Some stories are better left buried at sea." As Kane turned away to prepare for sleep, Eveline realized that her feelings toward her captor husband were becoming dangerously complicated. The cruel pirate who had forced her into marriage was also a man carrying wounds that had never properly healed, and despite every rational thought in her head warning against it, she found herself wanting to understand what had transformed an honorable gentleman into the feared Captain Kane. Outside their cabin windows, the ocean rolled endlessly toward distant horizons, keeping its secrets as carefully as the man who commanded the ship that cut through its depths. But Eveline was beginning to suspect that some secrets, once revealed, had the power to change everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and the true nature of the man she had been forced to marry. The revelation came during a storm that seemed to rise from the very depths of hell itself. The Serpent's Kiss was caught in mountainous seas off the Virginia coast, her crew fighting desperately to keep her afloat as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the timbers. Eveline clung to the cabin's fixed furniture, watching through salt-streaked windows as waves tall as buildings crashed over the deck. It was then that Catherine Blackwood appeared at the cabin door, her face pale with something beyond fear of the storm. "Lady Kane, I must speak with you. About your husband. About who he really is." Eveline helped the other woman inside, noting how Catherine's hands shook as she gripped the doorframe. "What do you mean?" "His real name," Catherine said, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "It isn't Darius Kane, it's Darius Ashworth." The words hit Eveline like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Ashworth is my family name." "He's your cousin," Catherine continued, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and relief at finally sharing her burden. "The younger son who was supposed to marry me 5 years ago, before everything went wrong." Eveline stared at the woman in stunned disbelief. "You're his intended bride?" "Was. Before my father betrayed him to Spanish agents who wanted revenge for his privateering activities. They killed his parents and destroyed his estate while he was at sea." Catherine's voice broke slightly. "When he returned to find everything gone, everyone believed him dead. I was forced to marry another man for protection." The cabin seemed to spin around Eveline as the implications crashed over her. "He's my father's nephew, the cousin who supposedly died in the war. Your father was part of the conspiracy that destroyed him," Catherine whispered. "Darius discovered that the Earl of Westmore had sold information about his activities to Spanish authorities in exchange for trading concessions. Your father sacrificed his own nephew for profit." Eveline felt sick, the truth reshaping everything she thought she knew about her family, her husband, and her own situation. "That's why he took me. Not for ransom or marriage, but for revenge." Before Catherine could respond, the cabin door flew open and Kane himself stood there, drenched and wild-eyed from battling the storm. His gaze went immediately to Catherine, then to Eveline's devastated expression, and his face went cold as winter seas. "I see Mrs. Blackwood has been sharing family history," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying more menace than any shout could have. Eveline rose on unsteady legs, facing the man she now knew was her own blood. "Is it true? All of it?" Kane stepped fully into the cabin, water pooling at his feet, and for the first time since she had known him, he made no attempt to hide his emotions. She saw rage there, and pain, and something that might have been regret. "Every word," he confirmed. "Your beloved father destroyed my family for Spanish gold. He turned his own nephew over to men who tortured my parents to death while searching for information about my ship. But you lived," Eveline said, her voice hollow. "You became a pirate to survive. I became a pirate to get justice," Kane corrected harshly. "And marrying you was meant to be the first step in destroying everything your father holds dear." The brutal honesty of his admission should have filled Eveline with hatred, but instead she felt only a strange numbness. "And now? Now that you've had your revenge?" Kane stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the internal war playing out across his features. "Now I discover that revenge tastes like ashes, and that the innocent daughter of my enemy has become," he struggled with the words, "has become precious to me in ways I never expected." Catherine moved toward the door, sensing that this conversation needed to happen without witnesses. "I'll leave you both to sort this out." After she left, Eveline and Kane stood facing each other in the storm-tossed cabin, the truth hanging between them like a blade. Outside, thunder crashed and lightning illuminated the chaos of the tempest. But inside, a different kind of storm was reaching its climax. "What happens now?" Eveline asked quietly. "Do you return me to my father as a broken daughter? Do you kill me to complete your revenge?" Kane moved closer, his sea-glass eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "What happens now is that I choose between the man I became and the man I once was, between justice and mercy, between revenge and—" He reached out to touch her face with surprising gentleness. "And love." The word hung in the air between them, fragile as spun glass. Eveline felt her heart skip at the raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was finally allowing her to see. "Love?" she whispered. "Against all reason, against all justice, I've fallen in love with my enemy's daughter," Kane admitted, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "You've become my conscience, Eveline, my reminder that there's still something human left in what I've become." Eveline studied his face, seeing past the scars and the hardness to the broken man beneath. "And I've fallen in love with a pirate who was once an honorable gentleman, who chose to become a monster to survive betrayal." When Kane kissed her, it was with the desperate passion of a man who had found salvation in the most unlikely place. Eveline responded without reservation, finally understanding that the enemy who had captured her was also the family she had never known she'd lost. "What do we do about my father?" she asked against his lips. Kane's smile was sharp, but no longer cruel. "We live well, and we love completely. That's the best revenge of all, refusing to let his betrayal destroy our chance at happiness." As the storm began to subside outside, Eveline realized that her forced marriage had become something far more complex and precious than either of them had expected. She had married a pirate captain to save lives, but in the process, she had saved his soul and found her own heart. The truth about their shared past had the power to destroy them, but instead it had freed them both from the chains of deception that had bound them. In each other's arms, they had found not just passion, but redemption. Two lost souls who had discovered that love could indeed conquer the deepest betrayals. The Serpent's Kiss sailed on through calming seas, carrying Captain Kane and his lady toward whatever future they would build together, their love forged in storms and tempered by truth.